Welcome. Thank you very much for coming. Wow. Let's get started because I have really a lot of stuff. And I don't want to rush through, especially not at the end. So my topic today, what does it take to grab a cupcake? I want to present a few things, a few insights from neuroscience, how feedback work in the brain, and sort of want to tickle your thinking and your understanding of feedback loops. So let's get started. First of all, thank you very much to the Lean Kanban University, and especially Janice and Todd for inviting me here, and Janice for being the guinea pig, providing me feedback during the preparation of my presentation, and also Patrick for his feedback. And I want also to thank you my former professor, Peter König, who gave me a few insights during the alumni meeting at University of Osnabrück. And of course, my boss, Petra von Stromberg, the CEO from Lotto24, for allowing me to come here. Okay, a few details about myself. I studied cognitive science and graduated exactly to this month, I think, 10 years ago in neuroscience and AI. And right after that, I started at Sun Microsystems, the Open Office division, and later at Oracle. And currently, I'm engaged with Lotto24, a small lottery business in Hamburg. And I started my Kanban experience in 2013, I think, right after the Lean Kanban Central Europe, and started working with Kanban on portfolio level. And this is actually my 7th Lean Kanban conference, 2nd in the US. And tomorrow, I think, we'll start the retreat. It's also going to be my 7th retreat. And we are the geeky couple, right? The geeky Kanban couple. We have a small family business at Flow.Hamburg. And we are the guys who play Flow Lab at the weekend with our kids. They like it pretty much. And they're quite good at it. Let me present shortly my line of thought today. So my assumptions are that if you think, business environments are dynamic and complex, and organizational survival is sort of determined by organizational capability to sort of move inside this context. I think we all agree that that's probably what we call business agility. So I assume that the organization must have developed some sort of brains, some capability, right, to move around, and feedback loops to coordinate their movements. And I suggest to, study that dysfunctions of movements, organizational dysfunctions, are the result of dysfunctional feedback loops. And that studying dysfunctions will help us actually understand how feedback loops operate under normal conditions and how we could improve this. This is sort of my baseline story today. But why am I standing here? You know this. That's the cover of the blue book. Kanban, successful evolutionary change for your technology business. And there's the word evolutionary in it. And evolutionary change is sort of core to the Kanban method at what we understand in evolutionary change. Imagine you have an initial process, you evaluate it according to fitness criteria, for instance, you change a little bit, you evaluate again, and then you move on your journey of change. You also can roll back because you don't change things which would possibly lead to your sort of extinction until the end of time, because the future process is emergent and you don't know how it's going to be because the context can change, and that's what we call or understand the evolving process as compared to a planned or managed process, right? Nothing new or special here. And I think I found it let me check in my notes. It's from a post from December 2010 by David. evolutionary process cannot work without feedback loops. So this is a second elementary part of the Kanban method. And we see that all over the place, right? Evolutionary concepts and feedback loops are sort of elementary to the method. And same thing applies to enterprise services planning. If you have attended the KMP 2 course, which is sort of organized around the 7 cadences, Kanban cadences, except strategy review, which is part of ESP, you will understand that it's sort of core to it. So in summary, we have 2 pillars of Kanban, right? We have the evolutionary change, like the mighty principle of all, and the second mighty principle is the feedback loops. So understanding this is fundamental to implementation of Kanban systems and also improvement, right? So that's sort of why it is important to talk and understand about feedback loops. And the motivation for this talk, sort of how came it all about, Mike Burrows, probably you know him, just posted a simple question to the KCP Alias, I think it was November 2017, with a really simple question. And what makes a good feedback loop, right? What makes a good system of feedback loops? So we started a quite interesting discussion, and I was thinking, okay, how can I contribute to this discussion? So I started digging. And let's check a few basic principles of feedback loops. Coupling, right? That's like the most basic thing. You have part 1, you have part 2, and you add a linear relation to these parts, right? And we say that part 1 dominates part 2. No feedback yet. Then you add another relation, and the whole thing becomes a dynamic because part 1 affects part 2, and part 2 affects part 1. That's sort of a chicken-egg problem, right? And Don Reinertsen writes in his book, Managing the Design Factory, also similar. You have closed-loop systems, which have feedback, and you have open-loop systems, which don't have feedback. And an example, for instance, for an open-loop system, in evolutionary theory, you have the polar bear, right? And the climate changes and getting colder. The polar bear sort of develops a thicker fur, right? That's a relation between 2 parts. However, the polar bear does not affect the climate, right? There's no feedback there. Different to the humans. We affect the climate. So a few more examples to feedback loops. We have co-evolution. We have 2 species with a strong relationship, like cheetah and gazelle. And over a long time period, they develop their capability of running. You know? The faster the cheetah can run, they eat all the ones which are slower. And those gazelle that can run faster survive, sort of. And this affects, again, the capabilities of the cheetah and how they evolve. That's a positive reinforcing loop, yeah? Nothing special. Then we have another one, that's prey-predator population, a negative loop. The more prey we have, the more predators. On the other hand, if the population of predators increases, the population of prey decreases because they just eat more, right? That's a negative loop. It has different properties than the positive loops. Another one, also negative, relationship or issues between teams, right? You have a topic you fight about, and that leads to you talk about less this topic. You try to avoid talking about it, you don't resolve it. So you fight more about this topic. It's a negative feedback loop. Does it really stabilize? Right? Is it something good? Don't think so. And the most famous, I think, if you've attended Patrick's sessions about flow, you've probably seen that in a more elaborate way. I have a simplified version here. You start work, you have more blockers, you start more work, and that's our vicious cycle, right? So let's sum up. We have two types of feedback loops with radically different effects, right? We have the positive feedback loops and negative ones. Difference is that the in and out signal in positive feedback loops is the same. It has a reinforcing effect, produces possibly instability, and maybe even catastrophe. However, on the other side, you have the negative feedback loops, right? The signal sign is different. There's rather a damping effect and produces stability, like in the prey and predator example. And however, it's resistant to change, because of these effects. So I started digging further and found out, okay, feedback loops are sort of pervasive. They're everywhere. Nature, societies, economies, businesses, our work systems, individuals. And they have impacts on different scales, from climate change, conflict, Black Fridays, I mean, not the ones Amazon does, learning and disease in individuals if they're broken in the brain. We come to that later. But how about technology? Right, and during my research, I dug out this German book, and I think what Jürgen Beeth says is exactly sort of resonates with my attitude. Feedback in technology always works in the same predictable way until it's occasionally planned, fails, or the failure, right? Let me give you an example. My wife doesn't like this example. I do. So you have an engine, right? And you couple that, that's part one, with the transmission. And they affect each other. The engineers, they resonate with me now. You change the revs of the engine, change the behavior of the transmission. And if you change the gear, it affects again the engine. But now think about, have you seen an engine or the transmission evolving into something more? I didn't. Where's the improvement here? Don't see any. And that's sort of hits a point, or hits a nail. Ross Ashby from the 50s wrote a book on design for a brain, and really good quote here. What sort of a thermostat could, if assembled at random, rearrange its own parts to get itself stable for temperature? And I think that's a big difference to biological systems and feedback loops, and also organizational systems where humans are involved, unpredictable creatures. And that's why I think our sort of understanding of feedback loops, if you limit it more to the experience from control theory or control engineering, manufacturing, I think there's more to it. So that's why I sort of turned to the things I've learned at the university and tried to dig up an analogy from the brain. So what does it take to grab a cupcake? Brain and feedback loops. We start with the sea squirt. Very interesting creature. It starts off as an egg in the sea, develops a sort of tadpole-like creature. It has a spinal cord, really simple eye, and a tail for swimming, and even a simple sort of brain, really simplistic neural system for control of swimming. However, the thing loses its brain when it stops moving. As soon as it finds a place where it can survive, some rock, ground, maybe a boat, the brain sort of digests. I don't know the details, but I know that its capability of this brain is sort of gone because it doesn't need anymore. The brain disappears. And evolutionary scientists sort of have the assumption nowadays that you have to digest this number. 300 million years ago, brains came into being because they were necessary for movement, and those being animals that required motion either to feed, mate, or fight or flight were sort of favored by the evolution and developed their first nervous systems. And that's as 300 million years ago. That's quite some time, right? And let us see what's sort of requirements for the motion. Right? We need a movement apparatus like arms, legs, whatsoever. We need supporting systems. We need to process from external signals from the possibly very dynamic and hostile environment. We need to process internal signals from heart, lung, blood pressure, whatsoever. We need to coordinate all this. And for this, we need a brain. So some facts about the human brain. Around 3 pounds, 1 trillion of neurons. The next number I cannot even pronounce. Up to 10,000 of synaptic connections per neuron. A very large number of synapses. And the potential number of all connections is higher than the number of all atoms in the universe. So think about what you have in your head. More than the universe. 3 pounds, right? Very complex thing. So from a system thinking point that, it's large, it's complex, but it's not only the number, because more is different. And let us see what it means. Imagine you have just parts, right? Could be people in, I don't know what we're talking about, the Australian backcountry, not connected. Could be teams in an organization. And you change that, you add structure, bring them closer together, and you do the nasty thing, you connect them. And parts start interacting, right? They're interdependent. And if you zoom in, we'll see that these interconnections and interdependence, they start influencing each other, and they start to change. This is what I mean with biological systems, most of the time different to technical systems. And they change not only the input and output, the influence also changes the parts. So a new structure, the interaction between the parts, interdependence, reshaping and rewiring. It's called neuroplasticity in brain science. You get emergent properties. And all that you get just through the presence of feedback loops. So that's why I think it's a remarkable thing. It's worth studying and finding out how it works. So what does it take to grab a cupcake? Beyond your, arms, legs, it takes a brain and feedback loops. And during the course of now what's, the presentation, I want you to keep thinking about under which condition do organizations operate nowadays? What is necessary for organizational survival? Do all organizations need movement? Which don't? Do all organizations have a brain to move? How about governmental? They will survive with your tax money. Do they need a brain? Okay, guys, now brains on. Humans move with a purpose, right? The challenge, huge challenge. We have a huge degrees of freedom in limb movement. We have almost infinite number of possible muscle activation patterns, massive redundancy in the brain, and naturally occurring errors. The brain is not perfect. It does a lot of things it shouldn't be doing. So the basic of motor control. You have the cortex. It has all the plans, right? It has direct connection to the spinal cord and muscles. But that's not enough. You have 3 other areas here. You have the basal ganglia and the cerebellum. They have different responsibility. What you see here is a clear hierarchy, right? It's a division of labor. It's not cross-functional, by the way. And then you have the thalamus. And the thalamus is called sort of the gate to the consciousness, right? It's just to give you an overview, right? Let's dig inside. We will inspect more or less this area here, the basal ganglia. They're not necessarily anatomically connected, but functionally. And from the side, you see it here. And this thing here is the youngest part of the brain. That's the cortex, right? And if you take the motor loop, like cortico-basal ganglia loop, simplified, of course, really high level, and zoom in, the nasty thing is it has many other loops. It has the motor loop, and it has the executive loop. That's a cognitive loop. It's responsible for your decision making. Decisions such that Will you come to the session or not? Then you have the limbic loop. Now you maybe understand why your emotional state also has influence to your body states, right? On top of that, you have the eye movements loop. That's oculomotor loop. It's responsible for eye movements. And the principle behind that, I was just to sketch it shortly, that it's a chain of inhibitory and excitatory signaling, right? You have a burst firing rate at one area, which causes the other area to stop firing, which again disinhibits another area. So you remove the inhibition, and signaling can be processed, right? That's a basic, really simple principle, but it's all over the brain. But we will only concentrate on this motor loop. And this is like a zoom in, really simplified. If here are any other neuroscientists, please don't shoot me, because it's otherwise really hard to understand. It took me, I think, 2 months to get this thing prepared. Okay, a little bit simplified. Get loose of the buzzwords. As you see, there are a couple of different ways how this area can communicate and how the loop can be closed, right? We have the direct pathway. That's this part here. And then we have an indirect pathway. This sort of shortcut here through the SDN area. And let us check how the direct pathway works. So you have a lot of signaling from the cortex, right? A lot. It hits the striatum, it gets activated. However, this thing has an inhibitory effect on the area here. It's called internal pallidum. You don't see it. Oh. Okay, and through this inhibition, it leads the thalamus to being close the loop and being active, increase activity toward the cortex. Right? On the other hand, we have the indirect pathway, and when the signaling from cortex hits the striatum and goes this way, it also has an inhibitory effect on the external pallidum, which leads to disinhibition of SDN, which then can fire away towards the internal pallidum. And since this thing has a tonic inhibitory effect on the thalamus here, it knocks it completely out. So you cannot close the loop, right? You have very little activity towards the cortex. So these are the basic pathways which control motor movement. So you have two pathways and opposing effects, right? The one is sort of decreases the inhibition of the thalamus, which leads to more excitation of the cortex, more overall activity. And you can sum it up. If you take the direct pathway, you have a go signal. You go through the indirect pathway, you're knocked out, right? Discarded. So the basic functionality of basal ganglia is the selective initiation or suppression of movement. This area modulates the flow of actions. But how is it achieved? Who decides where to go, right? Dopamine does. How is it done? I add another area here. It's called substantia nigra. And in that area, dopamine is produced. And it's being released into the striatum. However, the thing has two different dopamine receptors. And depending on the dopamine receptors, where you sort of digest the dopamine, it leads again to different effects. And its effect on the direct pathway, it's sort of expedites communication through the direct pathway through inhibition of this area called internal pallidum. And it increases the activity toward the cortex. If you take the indirect pathway, the thing which is there is a D2 receptor as an inhibitory effect, which leads to knocking out of this area which was here before, the SDN, right? And leads again. So if you have a release of dopamine in the striatum, cortical activity gets expedited, but not all, right? So it's a gating-like modulation through dopamine. Huh? Strong signals take the go pathway, are expedited. Weak signals take the no-go pathway, are delayed or discarded at all. However, dopamine bursts reinforce all that, right? So in sum, you have the support activation of intended motor programs and minimize interference with things you shouldn't be doing. Because the brain is active all the time, you have a lot of noise, and that should be modulated. However, dopamine is like about the cupcake, right? You see one, you want to have it. It's reward and punishment. So what happens is that the incoming signal is being compared to an expected value, and depending on what comes out, the amount of dopamine release is regulated. So you have there in that area a learning loop, which learns from expectation and experience and being adjusted. And the policy is select most rewarding programs, the go pathway. Avoid punishing ones and put them on a no-go pathway. Filter out any noise, right? So you can actually execute the goal-directed smooth motion. Quotient, right? Tonic dopamine levels influence the relative balance. We know that from, how's it called? Drug abuse and stuff like that. The more dopamine you get, the more riskier choices you get. And the problem is, over time, you get insensitive to negative outcomes, right? So what does it take to grab a cupcake? The challenge, as I said in the beginning, a lot of high degrees of freedom for limb movement, infinite number of possible muscle activations. That's the reason why the cortex had so many ideas, which have to be filtered out. First of all, forgot that, you have the limbic system, right? You see the cupcake, you want it, because there's a reward behind it. If you eat it, dopamine is being released. Then you have the motor cortex. That's way cool. I have all the connections you need. Fire away. I have a direct call to the muscles. Execute. It's not enough, right? That would be an open loop system. I think you wouldn't be able to grab the cupcake because you would be doing a lot of other stuff. So on the other hand, you have the basal ganglia and the cerebellum and the interface to the cortex. And this thing here is responsible for selection and sequencing the right activation patterns. On the other hand, you have the cerebellum, which is responsible for error control during execution. And in sum, you end up with something like that. This area, of course, it's not black and white. It's responsible for doing this thing right. No, the right thing. So the what pathway. On the other way, you have the how pathway. That's responsible for getting things done right. And both the basal ganglia and the cerebellum have innate sort of learning mechanism. The one learns through reward and punishment, so dopamine, and the cerebellum learns through error control, so doing things better. I think we are all kind of familiar with that picture, right? Okay, grabbing a cupcake. Motivation through the limbic system, huge number of activation plans, selection and sequencing through reward and punishment, excitation, detailing out the plans, because the cortex does not have detailed plans, and execution. And during execution, you have continuous monitoring through the cerebellum, because it has a copy of action plans, which are in the cortex and in the muscles, and continuously adapt, because, if I want to grab a cupcake and someone else grabs it first, I have to adapt. Summary. Movement is a complex product of multiple areas, right? These areas are organized in hierarchy, and they are interconnected through specific pathways. So don't let fool you. The brain is not completely interconnected. So the cells and the areas there are specific pathways which are responsible for specific actions, right? And balance is achieved through using both loop types. So positive loop types for reinforcing things. On the other hand, you also have negative loop types for achieving balance during motion. And dopamine modulates all this all on the fly, right? So I found this picture from the University of Colorado quite depicting. So basically, the basal ganglia, you have all possible responses here, and only those get through which are most active. So that's the picture of the gating mechanism inside the basal ganglia. So think about what kind of feedback loop types have you seen in your context, in your organization. What are the inner mechanics of those loop types? Because when you zoom in, kind of. And have the loop types changed over time, maybe? And since Patrick here, I want to tackle your brain and think, have you recognized the rational part of your brain? And have you recognized also the intuitive part of your brain? Right? Think about it. Okay, now we come to the dysfunctions. Why study dysfunctions? I said the brain is so complex, it's really hard to figure out how it operates under normal conditions. So what the neuroscientists usually do, they observe a sort of dysfunction and try to figure out and learn how the brain works under normal conditions. So in motor control, we have actually two types of dysfunctions. Either you have difficulties initiating movement, that would be too little, it's called hypokinesia, or you have too much movement, right? We have hyperkinesia. And I will present here two of the most prominent diseases. The Parkinson disease, which results basically from the death of neurons in that area I showed you before, and which leads to lack of dopamine and problems initiating movement. And if you are really late in this disease, so it progressed a lot, you will also face problems in terminating movements which are already running. That's again this picture. This area here is affected. If you reach a stadium where more than 50% of the neurons are dead in that area, you will resemble or see the consequences of that. So you have a lack of dopamine in striatum, and that leads to imbalance in the whole loop system. And the resulting effect is that a lot of things go through an indirect pathway and are being delayed or discarded, right? So initiation of movement is rather hard. So this is this area, and in a Parkinson condition is, right? So what, in our Cupcake example, what would happen, right? This area would receive a lot less of activation, right? Because the loops inside basal ganglia are not working properly anymore. The loop is still there, but the inner mechanics changed. And what would that mean? You would have, actually, a hard time initiating your movement in order to grab that cupcake. It would be rather slow or would not happen at all. On the other hand, we have the Huntington disease, right? It's also the death of the neurons, but in another part of this loop. And it affects another neurotransmitter. It's GABA. It's called GABA, yeah? And it causes problems suppressing unintended movements. As I said, the cortex is like the place of artisans, right? You have lots of ideas. Exactly. That's this area here. You cannot inhibit the external pallidum, which then knocks out the SDN. Exactly. In such that many of incoming signals from the cortex take the direct pathway and go back to the cortex. So a lot of motor actions are just executed without you actually intending to do this. And our example with the cupcake, you see the thicker arrows here, would lead to a lot of activity in the cortex, right? And direct to the muscles. Why? Because this damn thing has many possible activation patterns which should not be activated. So for the cupcake example, again, you will have a hard time grabbing your cupcake because other undesired movement would interfere with your intention, right? So dysfunctions sum up. You have two categories of movement disorders. Either you have difficulties initiating movement, or you have a difficulty suppressing movement. Huh? Both result from damage in the same loop. And it leads to an imbalance of excitation and inhibition, right? Which is required for all that. And to significant impact of overall motor activity. Organizational dysfunctions. Once again, want to repeat this function of motor control, 2 types. So I have the proposition that we can observe basically also 2 types of dysfunction in organizations. You have either too little movement or too much. So you have either difficulties to initiate what is desired, or maybe difficulties to discard what is running and not desired. On the other hand, you have difficulties to avoid what's not intended. You have constant interference, right? Let's just see my collection of organizational hypokinesia. You have cumbersome upstream process, right? You have analysis paralysis. You have starvation of downstream. Just stuff takes too long. Handoff processes, yeah? Sign-off processes. Large lead times for acquiring options, right? And information hiding or information radiators, like people in powerful positions. And lack of agreement about the intent. You know, if you discuss what is the right thing to do for half a year, you get exactly this dysfunction. And nicely, yesterday, Niklas and Frederik's talk, perfect example. And I don't remember who of the guys said this. The longer the process takes to launch a project, the harder it is to stop it. Bam! That's organizational Parkinson. On the other hand, you have organizational hyperkinesia. Difficult to avoid unintended stuff. Irrefutable demand. No demand shaping, right? That's what basal ganglia do. They do demand shaping. Premature commitment. Push behavior, right? No sense of capability. No sense of risk management. No sense of optionality. And the reward starting work instead of finishing. I think that's the worst one. Because whatever feedback loops you have, you don't know what's the reward system inside this feedback loop. Yeah, so what, right? I suggest that organizational dysfunctions are observable effects of dysfunctional feedback loops, right? And you need to look inside these things in order to understand why they result in particular dysfunctions. So I suggest the feedback lens, right? It's a copy of the Kanban lens, sort of. It's a beta stadium. I just, sort of came up with it a couple of weeks ago and be happy to discuss it further and evolve it during the retreat. In analogy to the Kanban lens, I suggest learn to view organizational behavior and movement as a result of a system of feedback loops that can be improved, right? Done with the picture. Let's move on. So what to look for? I did it exactly like the Kanban lens. What feedback loops are already there, right? How are they used? What are maybe no loops at all, and just open loop systems, where part 1 dominates part 2? What changes occur through active feedback loops? Remember the brain animation I presented? If you have working feedback loops, they change the interaction between the parts, but they also change the parts. And look for signs of organizational plasticity, where change happens all the time, right? What to do? Map how information and decisions flow through the system. Make it visible. Pay attention to what information or decisions go through and which don't. Find out why. And if neuroscientists have problems to figure out the systems and the feedback loops in the brain, they insert the virus. I mean, not to make this thing sick, but to trace. It's just a tracking pixel. Insert the virus into your organization and track it. Watch it propagate. Can be a project, can be a feature. The important thing is that you can track it, right, and see what happens. And identify the reward system. Because if you observe the feedback loop from maybe too high a level, you don't know what happens inside, and you don't know what the reward system is. If people get rewarded for starting work, they will start work and not finish it. You will still have maybe the feedback loop. Again, use the Kanban Litmus test. Has the customer interface changed? No, you have a dysfunctional feedback loop. Has the customer contract changed? No. You have a dysfunctional feedback loop. Has your service delivery business model changed? No. Again, you have a dysfunction. Has the manager changed their behavior? No. Probably a dysfunctional problem. So let me sum up. Great. Takeaways. Message number 1. Organizational movement. Living beings develop brains in order to move, right? Movement requires external and internal coordination. So we can assume organizations compete in an environment that favors those who can move swiftly. Business agility, right? And organizational movement requires a management system, call it brains, and feedback loops for coordination of external and internal processes or interactions. Message number 2. Dynamic loop types. In technical systems that we engineered by humans, feedback loop types are usually hardwired, right? Also, they can also be complex, that's true, right? But in natural occurring systems, they are usually not. They can change. This system can switch from escalation to de-escalation, from excitation to inhibition. So novelty can emerge, grow, and stabilize. I think a good example for that would be, I think David talks, do not overserve, right? Imagine you do fitness criteria review, you check, you want to improve, you have a positive feedback loop, you reinforce good things, but then you should stop. You should not overserve, right? You should change your feedback loop type into a negative one and stabilize until things change again. So I think organizations should develop their management capability to adjust and switch feedback loops types dynamically, right? Message number 3. Sort of the genesis of all that, right? Organizational plasticity. What's plasticity? And if you have attended the KMP2 course and read the POSIT Science case study, and their chief scientific officer, Dr. Michael Merzenich, is a well-known researcher in the field of brain plasticity. And so what's brain plasticity? The ability of your brain to reorganize itself, both physically and functionally. It's where I mean changing in the action and changing parts through your life due to environment, behavior, thinking, and emotion. And in this book from Mr. Bates, Feedback, he has a really nice example actually about the London taxi drivers. And a few neuroscientists did a study on those, and they sort of used fMRI, it's sort of a scanning of the brain, to figure out how is the brain structures of those taxi drivers. And they found out that those who work a lot, like many years as a taxi driver, they have different structures in the brain than normal people, right? Because they constantly have to orient inside London, right? They developed a better capability to find ways through London. However, yeah, what would it mean for organization plasticity? I think that would totally go out of scope of this presentation. Also, a really fascinating topic, for me at least. That might be a presentation for next year. Then one last thing from today's keynote. I just, in the last minutes, put that in here, since I was listening to David here. So I think, what's the dopamine in your organization? And maybe it's going to be a bold statement now, but I think it's your identity. So if you think that your identity is sort of the product of the neurotransmitters in your wiring in your brain that influence your identity, however, your behavior sort of reinforces how the neurotransmitter work in your brain. So I think, because they're in the loops, you have a loop, and dopamine can actually do that. Whatever you think you'll be doing, dopamine can do otherwise, right? Depends on the reward system inside your brain. So that's going to be my last sentence. Thank you. And while you're leaving, think about what does it take your organization to grab that cupcake, to grab the next opportunity, the feature, service request, and fulfill it, right? What does it need? Thank you very much.